Alright guys, so now we are going to be taking a look at the lead up and the effects of what actually happened in Pearl Harbor on that Sunday morning, okay? So just a real quick little review again, just to get a little bit more specific here. July of 1941, after Japan invades some places in the Pacific, we cut off trade with them. Specifically what they're most worried about is our trade with oil. Japan decides at that point that they need to find a way to take our oil reserves, specifically the ones that we have in the Philippines. So they need to cripple our Navy in order to be able to take control of our oil, okay? Our Navy is pretty much all in Pearl Harbor. The island of Hawaii is almost center between Japan and California, the United States. And so it's a really perfect location for Japan to be able to plan and implement an attack. In November of that year, Tojo sends a peace envoy to the United States to throw us off guard. Basically, they send an envoy to Washington, D.C. that is trying to, in theory, come up with a way to resume trade and remain peaceful. On December 6th, all peace talks are officially rejected by Japan. So everything that we have been doing since the envoy arrived in November, Japan basically comes back on the 6th and says, yeah, never mind, we don't like the terms, we're leaving. And then on December 7th, 1941, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was implemented. So just as kind of a quick little overview of what is going on here, this is something I'm sure you've heard about, but I really think that it's important to know kind of the details of what was happening that morning. So Pearl Harbor took place on about 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning. It's on the island of Oahu, which is one of the bigger islands of Hawaii. The Imperial Navy had brought ships with aircraft carriers with waves of planes in order to fly in and to attack. They had been planning for several weeks, maybe even months before the attack. It was a surprise attack conceived by Japanese Admiral Yamamoto. There were about 353 Japanese aircraft that were involved in this particular attack. There were approximately 100 U.S. naval ships present in Pearl Harbor that morning, including several different kinds, battleships, destroyers, cruisers, as well as some other smaller support ships. However, luckily, about half of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was out to sea, including our aircraft carriers. This is going to become really important for us after the attack. There was also on Hawaii, and I'll show you a map of this in just a second, an airfield, which was an Army airfield called Hickam Field. Hickam Field was also a victim of the surprise attack. Basically, anywhere that we had ships or planes or anything was subject to attack that morning. There were about 18 Army aircraft carriers, including bombers, fighters, and attack bombers, that were destroyed or damaged on the ground. However, a few of the pilots managed to get into the air that morning against the invaders. They kind of tried to fight them off as best they could. Obviously, not very many were able to do so. However, they do make a pretty good account of themselves. A total of 29 Japanese aircraft are shot down by ground fire, either from men who are firing from the ships with anti-aircraft guns or from the U.S. pilots from the various military installations on the island of Oahu. However, that day was vicious. You know, it's a Sunday morning, right? Like, people are sleeping in late, or they got up and went to church that morning. It's not something that, you know, they're expecting. We're not at war, right? They're in paradise. It's Hawaii. Like, what can possibly go wrong? However, when the surprise attack hits, it changes everything for the American military. I also think it's important to remember that this is basically an act of terrorism. There had been no formal declaration of war, despite the fact that we had shown that we were not really as neutral as we claim to be. We had not made any outright threats against Japan or Germany or anywhere else. This was just a way for Japan to make sure that they crippled our Navy enough that they could take over a lot of our oil reserves. So I'm going to show you some pictures. I'm going to warn you that some of these pictures are pretty tough to look at, but I do think they show you the good impact of what really happened in Pearl Harbor that day. So this is just kind of shows you where at 7:55 that morning, just before the attacks happened, where all of the different ships were in the harbor. So you can see that these are, the ships are actually clumped really close together. This was a major issue because that meant like fire could spread from one ship to the other. You see these bigger ships right here. These are some of the battleships. Particularly, I want to point out the Maryland, the Oklahoma, the Tennessee, the West Virginia, the Arizona. Okay, so you can kind of see where they are. You can see that Hickam Field is going to be a little bit more southeast here as we are looking at this. So this is the island of Oahu itself. You can see Pearl Harbor is in the south of the island. So these two images show where the Japanese planes went in. So the first wave of attack began at 7:55 that morning, and they came in on the west side of the island. A few of them went to Wheeler, which was an airfield over here, but most of the attack flew down and around. These are going to be more high-level bombers. They had actually made some like wooden fins on the bombers that are on the torpedoes that have made them to go into the shallow water a little bit easier. So the first wave came in, dropped their bombs here. An hour later at 8:54 a.m. the second wave came in. This one went to more of the fields. You can see the airfields were hit a little bit harder in the second wave. These are mostly fighter pilots. There was actually a planned third wave, but they ended up deciding not to initiate that third wave, seeing that they had inflicted as much damage as they already had. So just some pictures here. The dry docks are where like ships are taken to be cleaned or to be repaired. So these are some ships that are burning in the dry docks that morning. You can see obviously a lot of smoke, a lot of fire. These are ships that run on oil. They're flammable essentially, and they're basically like tin cans. Like the men are trapped inside of them, and that fire is going to cause it to heat up. If you ever seen metal in a microwave, that's kind of what this is like. This is one of the airfields, and you can just see how huge the smoke from the attack really is here. This is the USS Arizona. So the Arizona is the ship that was hit the hardest. It actually capsized underwater. It still resides in Pearl Harbor today. They never took the ship out. And so you can just see, I mean, how scary is that, right? Like how dangerous. Again, just seeing the devastation here from what was going on. This is just a shot from above. You can see the oil leaking from the ships, just the damage. That was how I showed you all the battleships that were lined up. You can see how that happened there. This one I think is really telling. Look at these guys. These are guys, and this is after the attack. These guys are like 18, 19 years old. They joined the Army and the Navy thinking that they're going to have time of their lives and meet nurses and it's going to be great. But if you look at the look on some of these guys' faces, right, they're shocked. They don't even know how to handle this sort of terror. And it's something that has finally made the war really real for these guys. This again is from Hickam Airfield. You can see the damage of the planes here. This is one of the ships. Afterwards you can just see just the devastation. So we're going to listen now to FDR's formal declaration of war speech. This was given on December 8th, so the very next day, where he asked Congress for a declaration of war. The speech was broadcast over the radio. Millions of Americans listened in. It's not a very long speech, but it kind of goes through what happened and what Japan had done. So you've got some questions that kind of go along with this. So I really want you to think about the argument that FDR uses here in the speech. I'm going to actually play the speech for you. But as you can see, the writing is also on the overhead if you have a hard time understanding some of what he is saying. So let's go ahead and listen up.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. And while this reply stated that it seemed useless to continue the existing diplomatic negotiations, it contained no threat or hint of war or of armed attack. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Okay, so as we wrap up talking about Pearl Harbor, I just want to give you a little bit of statistics here. So a little over 2,500 people died in less than the 2 hours of the attack. 1,000 people were wounded, and nearly 300 airplanes and 18 American ships were destroyed. Over half of the casualties of Pearl Harbor took place on board just one ship, the USS Arizona. The USS Arizona, as I said before, capsized in the midst of the attack. It was hit with 4 different torpedoes and turned upside down, trapping the men inside of it. Thousands of men, over 1,000 men inside that ship. When they were attempting rescues of the Arizona, for hours after the attack, they could hear tapping from the men inside the hull as they were saying where they are, we're here, until eventually those men suffocated and drowned inside the Arizona. And as I said, today the USS Arizona still lies in Pearl Harbor as a memorial to the men who died. They never pulled it back up because it serves as their tomb of the men who were killed inside of it. I was able to go to Pearl Harbor a few years ago, and I have some pictures that I just want to show you. So this is a photograph that I took just outside of the harbor. The white thing here, this is the walkway that you now walk on. It stands above the USS Arizona. This ship over here is the USS Missouri. The USS Missouri plays a pretty important role in the end of the war, and this became her resting place. As you can see, she got her guns pointed just over the Arizona. So you can see in this picture here, her guns are pointed over the Arizona to the mainland. She stands in defense of the Arizona and the men who died there. That is the symbolism of how her guns are still pointed to this day. So these are some of the remains of the ship under the water. So you can see pretty clearly the remains here. This is just one of the oil rigs of the ship. If you look really carefully, you'll notice that this water has a shimmer to it. That is oil. There's still oil leaking out of the Arizona. There's enough oil left in the USS Arizona to be leaking out for the next 10 years. It's already been underwater since 1941. So that just kind of tells you a little bit of how big and devastating this really was. This is just an aerial view. I obviously didn't take this picture, but this is the rig that you just saw here. So you can see the Arizona still lying underneath the water's surface. Thousands of people visit the Arizona every day as a memorial to the men who died. Pearl Harbor was the most devastating attack on American soil until September 11th, 2001. it became a rallying cry for people. There was no more talk of neutrality, with headlines like this all over the country, that we are going to war. America was united in this front. We had been attacked. Japan was first on our list. As soon as we declared war on Japan, as Japanese allies, Germany then declared war on us just a few days later, as well as Italy, and we eventually pledged ourselves to the war in Europe as well as to the war in the Pacific. So the next few lectures we're going to be looking at kind of how the U.S. mobilizes to get ready for war, how the war is taking place, the different battles and some of the different things that were fought. But just always remember, I think it's easy for us to forget Pearl Harbor. It's easy for us to forget the devastation that it caused and the effects that it has still on people whose families suffered through it, and what it meant for people at the time in 1941. The sense of revenge and the sense of dignity and honor that it brought to our country are really important for understanding why we eventually got involved in World War I. So, with that said, I will see you guys soon.